everyone, it's Sharon Kelly from the Berwick Public Library. To celebrate Maine's bicentennial, I'm proud to bring you a wonderful historical program made possible by the Maine Humanities Council and in partnership with Berwick Community TV. Our speaker today is Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe, Professor of History at University of New England. Dr. DeWolfe teaches women's history, archival research, and American culture. She considers herself a historical detective, scanning through archives for traces of ordinary women and piecing together their lives from disparate clues. Dr. DeWolfe's book about the short life and tragic death of a textile mill girl in the 1850s, The Murder of Mary Bean, won Outstanding Book of 2008 from the New England Historical Association. She also writes about anti-Shaker activists, 19th century political scandals, and the Maine Textile Workers Strike of 1841, which is what our program today is about. So I welcome Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe to the Berwick Public Library.
Thank you very much to the Berwick Public Library for the kind invitation to speak today. And I'd also like to thank the Maine Humanities Council for sponsoring this talk. Tonight I'd like to share the story of the Great Turnout of 1841. I'll speak about women's work in the mills, the forces that pulled them into factory life, and the cultural forces that pulled them out. And we'll think about the legacy of the 500 or so young women who dared to raise their voices and raise a ruckus. In late March 1841, a rumor floated through the York Manufacturing Company. Samuel Batchelder, the company agent, was going to cut wages again. In the boarding houses in the evenings, the more experienced operatives met and discussed what could be done. They decided to strike. On Monday morning, the carders and spinners, the warpers and the weavers would walk out of the mills. When Monday arrived, the young women were ready. They had breakfast and prepared to go to the factories for their morning shifts, beginning at 6 a.m. But on this day, March 29, 1841, the operatives gathered at the factory gates, but they did not enter. Instead, they gathered behind a marching band. They unfurled banners and marched through the streets of Biddeford and Saco. Nearly 500 young women, half the workforce of the York Manufacturing Company, turned out and marched through the streets, proclaiming, "We scorn to be slaves." The procession ended at Saco's Free Will Baptist Meeting House. Men and women made speeches and officers were elected. Grievances were aired and a list of resolutions was drawn up and sent to Samuel Batchelder. As a later report put it, these young women, most no older than 20, had greatly disturbed the quietude of our usual peaceful villages. They had engaged in a turnout, a strike, the very first labor agitation in Maine. Why strike? What did these young women hope to achieve? Mill work was the best paying occupation for young women in the antebellum era. In the roughly 25-year period from the 1830s to 1855, the majority of the labor force in New England textile mills was comprised of young, white, Protestant women aged roughly 14 to 24, who worked 6 days a week, earning, for pretty much the first time in American history, cash wages. The factories gave young women an opportunity to participate in the cash economy, to help support their families back home, and to fill their time and occupy their hands as factory-produced goods lessened the household tasks needing to be accomplished at home. Really, textile work was an extension of the type of domestic labor young women had been performing for generations, albeit with much more powerful machinery. With the Industrial Revolution and the rise of factories, young women's labor became superfluous. In urban areas and the well-settled Northeast, households no longer made candles, soap, cloth, and other material goods that were now simply far cheaper to purchase. Thus, in that period between girlhood and marriage, young women had idle hands. But what self-respecting father would allow his daughter to leave hearth and home for the city of Biddeford or Lowell or Dover? To reassure worried parents, textile mills enacted a series of innovations to deal with their predominantly young female workforce. These included strict regulations: no one younger than 14, no one who used liquor. Smallpox vaccinations or proof of having had the disease were mandatory. Young women lived in company-managed boarding houses where a house matron, often a widow, kept careful watch on her charges. Infractions of the rules were reported to the mill owners. There were curfews and rules about appropriate visitors and a requirement to attend religious services. Room and board charges were automatically deducted from the mill operative's pay. In some mills, pew rent was taken out as well. The remaining wages were the mill girls to keep, although technically any wages earned by a woman, by law, belonged to her father if she were single, or her husband if married. The regulations were designed to protect the reputations of young women and therefore assure parents that it was okay to send their daughters to the mills. Of course, this is really in the manufacturer's best interest. They needed a workforce, and a workforce that would show up at 5 o'clock in the morning and get right to work. Curfews and a tight regulation on private time helps. In Saco and Biddeford, the mill girls lived on Factory Island, conveniently located between the two villages. The rise of the textile mills provided not only occupations for women and for young men, but numerous satellite businesses, boarding houses, stables, blacksmiths, stores, carriages. In the 1840s, Saco and Biddeford boomed. One enterprising young man wrote home to his friends. He said, "There is not a room to rent or a business to be let." Biddeford became the richest place per capita in Maine, and by some accounts, in the United States. The wealth trickled down to other communities too. Farmers sold crops to feed the mill workforce, and those who grew potatoes sold them to starch mills, which processed the potatoes into starch, which was used for sizing calico and other cotton fabrics. The 1840s saw a boom in starch factories in Maine. The textile factories also used a tremendous amount of coal, whale oil, tallow, and other lighting and heating products. And this economic success fell squarely on the shoulders of the girls at the York Manufacturing Company. Women were 80% of the workforce. Textile work was highly regulated, with a system of bells to ring workers into the factory and then out again. If you were late, you didn't work and you did not get paid. You've probably noticed in towns like Biddeford or Lewiston or Lawrence, Massachusetts, if you're driving down 495, that the most prominent feature is the clock tower. This represents a key shift in how Americans thought about the day. Previous to the Industrial Revolution, one worked according to task. You milked when the cow's udders were full, you made cider when the apples were ripe, you seeded the soil when spring allowed. But the Industrial Revolution and factory work is organized around time, and time, as we well know today, is money. This is all about maximizing the efficiency of your labor force to produce products. Now, trains play a key role in this too. The train first arrives in Saco in 1842, and when trains are moving back and forth, it's a really good idea to send them on their destination, not when the car happens to fill up, but rather when other trains won't be on the track. So schedules, according to time, come to organize and order many people's lives. With our day planners and calendar phone apps today, we know all too well the outcome of the move to making efficient use of time. For money, for freedom, to make a productive use of time, or simply for an adventure, young women flocked to the mills. The manufacturing process was vertically integrated. In other words, in the factory building, all steps of cloth making occurred, from sorting and cleaning the raw cotton, to turning cotton into yarn, to setting up looms, to weaving the fabric, and then finishing the fabric. Workers made good money. In 1841, at the York Manufacturing Company, after room and board was removed from one's pay, carders cleared $1.48 a week, spinners $1.67, weavers around $2, warpers just over $2, dressers who finished the fabric could clear $2.40 to $2.74. The wages compared favorably, if not better, to other female occupations such as teaching, domestic service, or sewing. Room and board in the mid-1830s to 1840 was $1.25 a week. So girls were pocketing anywhere from $1.50 to $2 or more cash per week. Now this work was dangerous. Factories were noisy. The air was filled with fabric dust which could lead to respiratory problems, and that dust was highly flammable. And it did happen that fires turned workrooms into infernos. Dresses, limbs, or long hair could get caught in the fast-moving machinery with gruesome results. Operatives worked up to 14 hours a day, and mill agents pushed their limits. At first, you might handle one loom, then two, then four. This was vastly different from the spinning or weaving these women's grandmothers would have done in what would now be an old-fashioned home. The agents did provide free medical care to its employees, sending physicians to boarding houses when someone fell ill. This system was paternalistic, caring for the physical and moral health of their employees. In Saco, there were writing lessons and a lending library. In Lowell, the mill sponsored a factory operative literary journal where young women could try their hand at writing essays, short stories, poems, opinion pieces, or could even serve as an editor. The mill agents used the Lowell offering as proof that work was not harmful to young women, but in fact it could be educational and better fit them for their future roles as mothers, raising the next generation of American citizens. And despite the long days, young women enjoyed all that these factory towns had to offer. In Saco, the place to be after work was Pepperell Square, where the goal was to see and to be seen. Girls had their photographs taken or went shopping for knickknacks, candy, hair ribbons, and other fripperies, as the critics called their purchases. There were lectures or performances to attend, or they could stay in their boarding house parlors and write letters, sew, or entertain an appropriate guest. But a key point here is that these young women could decide for themselves what to do. They discovered what today we would call their own agency. So in 1841, Saco Biddeford is starting to boom. Young women have found a lucrative employment that offered a different path from domesticity. The factories made lots of people very prosperous. And then the mill girls turned out. There was precedent for the turnout. In Dover, New Hampshire in 1828, 300 to 400 mill girls went on strike and marched in a procession of women, firing off gunpowder. In 1834, a second strike saw 800 women marching in protest against several restrictive regulations. In Lowell in 1834, women protested wage reductions. In 1836, women struck against a rise in the cost of board. The 1830s across New England was a time period of the general awakening of labor, with several protests and the origins of protective associations, such as the Factory Girls Association of Lowell. So Maine girls were part and parcel of this trend, and no doubt got their idea and language from participation in or knowledge of these earlier protests. Mill girls did travel from mill to mill, seeking better wages or better working conditions, and carrying stories of protests with them. Protest took a very familiar form: marching in public, music or gunpowder, and songs or chants using patriotic language, such as the mill girls describing themselves as daughters of freemen or having patriotic ancestors. The verb enslave was frequently used, as well as statements that the women would refuse to be a slave. The Biddeford Protest followed this cultural script. So the Biddeford strikers marched through the streets of Biddeford and Saco and ended up at the meeting hall on Temple Street. Their demands included demands about boarding. The operatives resisted being forced to live in company housing. Complaints included rising prices for board, but also cramped quarters, lack of ventilation, and the dangers of illness. They also made demands about their wages. Operatives pointed to a wage reduction of April 1840 that had come with an implied promise to restore wages once conditions had improved. But that hadn't happened, and now there was a looming additional cut. There were 2 or 3 days of what were termed fruitless negotiations. Batchelder finally made a demand of his own: come back to work tomorrow, or don't come back at all. And most didn't. Some of the girls went home. Some took other jobs in Maine, or they went to Lowell, which was desperate for skilled textile workers. The turnout had failed. Dorcas Harmon Nutter, who participated in the strike, later in life reminisced. She said, "A few went back, but the majority of the young women proved loyal and went elsewhere for work." Describing this momentous event, she said, "We had a just grievance. We did not win. The corporation was too strong." And she was right. They did have a just grievance, and the corporation was very strong. Concerned about the upset the mill girls had caused, a town committee was formed to investigate their concerns. The committee was comprised entirely of men, none of whom had ever sewed a stitch or run a loom. They investigated the cause of the turnout and blamed 2 disgruntled older women, meaning women in their 20s, who had, they concluded, cajoled inexperienced girls and plotted to bring the maximum number of workers out of the mill. In the committee's mind, these ringleaders had plotted to have the majority of the workforce walk out. But instead of walking out at a designated time, which was the initial plan, the strike organizers talked up the turnout during breakfast, realizing it would be easier for women to simply not enter the mill rather than walk away from work once they were already inside. It was a clever and effective strategy to gain adherence. But the committee dismissed the wage reduction of 5 cents per week and called it inconsequential. And as for diseases, they pointed out that the mill provided a company-hired doctor who assured the committee that there was a lack of epidemic disease. The committee found for the mills. Clearly, the leading men of the committee and other business leaders were more worried about investors catching wind of unrest in the mills. Let the factory handle its own affairs, they concluded. It's in everyone's best interest. Well, perhaps everyone but the female employees. In addition to keeping investors happy, mill agents needed to assure the parents of mill girls that factory towns were safe places for their daughters. What kind of a community was this where young women, girls, are rallied up to march publicly in the streets? Being out of parental surveillance could be even more dangerous than parading up Main Street. And there are numerous dramatic stories of girls who went down an unfortunate path. In Biddeford and Saco, it was the story of a young woman who was known as Mary Bean, who was seduced, left pregnant, and died at the hands of a Saco doctor. Her death tore open the dark side of factory life. If, as a newspaper editor opined, these were the modern times of progress, was the price for progress the death of young women, the future mothers of the next generation? Mary Bean's story, in fact, was not only discussed in the newspaper, but it transitioned from fact to fiction. There were many stories that fictionalized facts, made dramatic interpretations that took the gray of real life and made it black and white. A city populated by evil seducers and innocent, naive girls. Dozens of such stories abounded in the 1840s and 1850s. And later, when white, native-born women left the mills, the scenes of such sensational stories moved on to the dangers of being a shop girl or a garment factory worker or even a college student. The moral of these stories was always the same. For young women to be safe, they should simply stay home. And in New England in the 1840s, there's actually a bit of cultural backlash against the mill girls, those who agitated for better conditions and those who stepped off the path of the straight and narrow. This is a poem that highlights a pro-mill perspective, the mills recasting the work experience as healthy, moral, preparatory for young women's true roles, wives and mothers, who no longer worked. Let me show you a better image of the text. So this poem was written by someone named C. Austin somewhere around 1852, shortly after the death of Mary Bean and the trial for her murder. This poem begins with an ideal description of young women in the mills. Pleasant 'tis to see in the factory, with spirits light and free, busy as a bee, the girl most beautiful. Features fair and bright, smiling soft and white, from morn's early light to the shades of night, most kind and dutiful. And so here we have this beautiful, dutiful, cheerful young woman who is just happy to work in the mills. Now, there were many complaints being raised about mill work, not only by the mill girls, but by their defenders as well. One worry about mill work was, would this ruin young girls' health? And so the poet, Austin, takes on this worry. Sages all confess, exercise will bless ladies more or less, and that idleness always will distress the fair most fearfully. So here the author argues that it's better to work in a factory and get exercise than stay home and be idle. As we all know, idle hands are the devil's workplace. It's also interesting how the poet calls these ladies more or less, meaning that they're in between the youth of girlhood and being a young woman of marriageable age. They're ladies more or less in this transitory period. Now, in addition to health, there were certainly complaints about wages. Here's how Austin addresses that. What though some may say, scanty seems her pay, yet without delay little every day earned and laid away soon amounts to a considerable. Work, as if by stealth, paves the way to wealth and to rosy health and to a well-filled table. So saving your money will add up over time, and what will you do with that? You'll use it for your future table, providing for your own future family, husband, and children a well-filled table. Austin goes on to itemize several of the virtues that ideal mill girls would have. They would be frugal, again, saving for that well-filled table. They would spend not a penny of her hard-earned money foolishly for any worthless thing, as many oft do most needlessly, taking on the mill girls who wanted to use their own hard-earned wages to buy themselves a little treat, a piece of candy, a hair ribbon. Good girls should be frugal. Good girls should also be moral, as Austin suggests, being inclined, useful books to find to improve her mind. You shouldn't be reading any of that sensational fiction like that Mary Bean story. Stick to useful books, like the Bible. Mill girls should not be vain, Austin tells us, taking much more care with rich trimmings rare and a garment fair to deck and prepare mind than body bare. Mind, which is an heir to a mansion. So here Austin tells us, don't worry about your physical appearance. Don't be vain. Instead, focus on your mind, which will be an heir to the ultimate mansion, the mansion of heaven. And it's interesting in sensational fiction, especially about factory girls, if one of the characters buys a hair ribbon or buys a dress or admires herself extensively in a mirror, she's surely going to be dead by the end of the story. Vanity will be your undoing. Religion, too, of course, is important in this poem. Virtue's path pursue, and religion's too, making but a few needful garments new for the body do, in plain simplicity. The irony here is that girls are working in a textile factory, which is bringing down the price of cloth so that you can make multiple garments if you like, but not according to Austin. 1 or 2 dresses will do. And Austin completes their poem, and we don't know if Austin is male or female, but Austin completes their poem with just a marvel of 19th century rhyming literature. Such a brilliant brightness, such a lovely lightness, such a snowy whiteness, such a firm uprightness, such a frugal tightness, such a nimble sprightliness, such a kind politeness, oh, how delectable. Such a flying fleetness, such a needful neatness, such a true discreetness, such a charming sweetness, such a rare completeness, oh, how respectable. And that is the goal, not to be rich, but to be respectable, to maintain your virtue, to maintain your purity, to land yourself a good husband, because you are a good, moral, virtuous young woman. In the end, the poem concludes with the flip side of the pieces of sensational fiction, where young girls come to the factories, end up pregnant, seduced, insane, dead, or a prostitute. This poem gives a happy outcome of mill work. Many a lovely girl, destined to unfurl, charming beauty's curl, where the waters hurl and the spindles twirl, may see fortune whirl with great agility, making her a wife, free from want and strife, living a happy life with rich blessings rife in great gentility. So work if you are virtuous, frugal, you save your money, you stay on the moral religious path, you'll get what you need. You'll find a husband. And so factory work was seen as temporary, something to fill a young woman's time until she was ready for marriage. By 1855, the young white Protestant women had left the mills, and they were replaced with immigrant daughters, Greek, Irish, eventually French-Canadian in Maine. Middle-class moralists were less concerned with those daughters, and the patronizing paternalistic supervision of the workforce faded away. So the Biddeford strike failed to restore wages or prevent the mills from controlling where girls lived. But it was successful if we take a longer view. The first lesson, for both the young women and the mill owners was the power of collective action. The strikers brought the factory to a halt at the cost of considerable money each day. Time is money, and money is power. In organizing meetings, these young women practiced crafting an agenda, honing an argument, advancing a demand. They learned the power of numbers and that their individual experience was mirrored by that of other women workers. 150 years later, feminists would say the personal is political. And it's important to recognize these women's willingness to voice concerns in a public forum. Marching on public display, holding a public meeting, speaking out in public when the cultural norm for women was to be dutiful, submissive, and at home. These women were brave and strong. Here's the upshot of earning cash wages in general. Women realized their economic worth and how their labor translates into success or happiness or survival in their own lives. Also, they learned that they're not alone in their experiences, and they come to understand gender, that how they are women determines just about every facet of their lives. And not everyone likes that. Women know that their normative future is tied to the financial, legal, and social protection of men. Earning one's own wages breaks that norm, and for some, it's liberating. For others, especially those worried about these noisy women in the streets, it's a terrifying prospect. It's not long after the Biddeford Turnout that women gather in Seneca Falls, New York for the first Women's Rights Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton helps to write the Declaration of Sentiments. This key document in women's history makes these very same points about gendered lives. And pragmatically, the Declaration of Sentiment includes demands for such things as women keeping one's own wages, having the opportunity to pursue higher education, opening the most lucrative and prestigious professions to women, such as lawyer, doctor, the ministry, college professors. Being able to divorce, being able to keep one's personal property that you brought into a marriage, abolishing the sexual double standard that permitted men to sow wild oats but would doom a woman for all eternity. And most controversial of all, the Declaration of Sentiments advocated for the right to vote, suffrage. And 72 years after that first Women's Rights Convention, women would succeed. Labor and suffrage become directly linked. Women's rights activists visited Maine. Lucy Stone came 3 times in the 1850s. Susan B. Anthony came in 1854. Maine author Elizabeth Oakes Smith spoke frequently on women's issues, including to mill operatives in Lewiston. Strikes continued. In 1854 in Lewiston, the strike featured a parade with a brass band and women in leadership roles. The strike failed. But there were successes. In 1857, Maine enacted a law that permitted a married woman to keep her own wages and to maintain an action in her own name. In other words, her own agency. In 1858, the first Maine petition for Maine women's suffrage was put forth. Some called it the damnable heresy of the generation. The Portland Labor Reform Association endorsed women's suffrage, and in 1865, Lewiston Mill girls marched in the July 4th parade with banners advocating suffrage, and some were even dressed in the shocking bloomer costume. The right to vote gives citizens, women included, the power of self-determination, that we have a voice in the laws that constrain and open up our lives. And for women, fair wages and equitable pay provides the means by which to self-sustain one's agency, to not be entirely dependent on father or husband. Ultimately, the Great Turnout was not an isolated incident. Strikes and agitation continued in Maine and beyond, demanding fair wages, safe conditions, and equal pay, among other concerns, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The mill girls were part of a chain of women across the centuries, finding how to use their voices to articulate their demands and to play a direct role in shaping their own lives. Those invested in maintaining a gendered status quo saw striking women as the source of mayhem and dead women as emblematic of the danger women faced when they moved beyond their sphere. Mayhem and murder were emblematic of a society upside down. Yet these women, in experiencing a modicum of financial independence, in enjoying geographic mobility, in exploring a newfound sisterhood with like-minded women, were taking those first steps into enjoying the freedoms that their brothers enjoyed as a matter of course. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John. She wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." March 31st, 1776. From Abigail Adams during the American Revolution to the Women's March of January 2017, when the mill girls of Biddeford turned out and marched down Main Street, they were marching for agency and self-determination in their own lives and in ours. Thank you.